Thank you. Und ich möchte ganz kurz Danke sagen, also vor allem Karl Salzmann und dem ganzen ÄSR-Team für die Einladung. Ich mache die Performance auf Englisch, weil mein Deutsch, vor allem mein Klangdeutsch, ist nicht wahnsinnig gut. Da fehlen mir die Worte, da fehlt mir die Grammatik und alles und so weiter. Aber gerne zur Diskussion, wenn es Fragen hat und so weiter, können wir auch bilingual einsteigen. Also ich möchte Englisch, das ist ja auch eine Kolonialsprache, nicht als Border gebrauchen, sondern eher as materiality, as a materializing. In that sense, you've also been listening now a long time. It doesn't matter if you don't listen semantically. I will say many words, but it doesn't matter if you don't understand them. It's not about really understanding. It's about also being in the rhythm of sound and being in the rhythm of music, I suppose. At the beginning of an electric storm, there is an audible nothing, an invisible tension that seems to form formlessly in the air, More felt than heard, it nevertheless agitates the ear, with anticipation and the smell of something coming, a different rhythm and a sharper view. The pressure decreases and unbalances the inner ear, confusing the vestibular system, which is its opening to the world. The body preempts and accommodates this drop by escaping into an aura, a vaguer vision of shimmering spots and stars that relies on the inside as much as on the outside to get its bearing and brace against the turbulence of unseen waves and undulations. Cranked up on Baroque theatre noise machines, reproduced faithfully from the measurement of those found at historical theatres, Arturas Bumsteinas' Bad Weather performs the obligatory storm of a 19th century opera with contemporary urgency and concern, making connections between weather, climate, fiction, sound, and reality that remain fragmented, complex, and mobile, conjuring what we think we can see on meteorological charge as invisible energy and forceful dimension that has abandoned the instrumentality of a clear vista and is not heard as music or as song. Instead, it shapes impressions on the membrane of the inner ear that make an indivisible territory and interact as rhythms, syncopated, expansive, entangled, and contradictory, rolling to the machine's cranking motion, sounding sparks and prongs, crackle and thumps, gripping into each other. It is not music but carpentry that becomes the work's virtuosity and reference, the craft of making weather out of wood and metal, and bodies moving, that sends the material into motion and transports the voice into its recitation, sped up and slowed down, whimsical and free, with, as the lyrics of Ivan Cheng's libretto suggest, and I quote, the right to travel over borders, end of quote. To exist in transit, forever changing without the violence of a certain form, and hinting at the interdependency of the world, whose national borders are ignored by the emergencies of local weather as part of global climate. Oh. Monte Alsudina. The wind tears the tent from our fists as we pin it down with rocks, boots, and horses, who hang around, noses dipping, as if drilling us for oil. We speak mostly in silence, words whipped from our mouths. It is 4:30 and hot, yet there is nothing to do but climb inside and fasten the doors. Even when the wind batters our backbones like pulses in a jar, and when you release the sip for a breath in the swelling heat, I see a horse flung off the mountain as if it was made of tin. In the morning, everything is still, as though waiting. We pretend this does not make us more afraid. We shake the dust off everything, turn ourselves inside out, and flap about like two old wives doing the linen. We do not speak of the clouds. By Sarah Jackson in Pelt. Produced from a selection of recordings made at rehearsals, workshops, and performances, Bumsteinas' opera Bad Weather sounds its process on the mobile blueprint of meteorological maps and unseen scores, creating a mise en scène of invisible currencies that talk with each other in the language of a storm that is brewing. Such a geography of sound produced by theatre noise machines has no map to pinpoint its territory or cite its source. It produces no cartography or taxonomy from authentic references and certain vocabularies. Instead, it is the geography of encounters, misses, happenstance and events of the invented and generative, invisible trajectories and configuration between human and more than human matter that unfold not in relation to something, but as relationships. In the dimension of the actual, by formlessly forming the dimension of its possibility. This is not the dimension of false truths, lies and trivial fictions, or of the hallucination of AI machines, whose tripping truth, according to Naomi Klein, does not carry mystical or psychedelic sense, which she explains as mind-altered states that can indeed assist in accessing profound, previously unperceived truths. Instead, according to Klein, AI simply makes things up by mashing up data, and I quote, even conjuring entire worlds that will put their products to use for our universal elevation and education. From her article in The Guardian, AI machines aren't hallucinating, but their makers are. These machine learning hallucinations perform the deceit of purposeful lies and not the mind-altering as in transformative possibilities of noise machines, which do not produce extractive machine learning, nor field recording source sounds, but perform generative human-machine realities, accessing new and plural truths. In this sense, the noise machines sounding bad weather conjure secret, unsound sounds, whose mysticism is productive and whose real material fictions generate impossible territories, worlds that we cannot or do not want to see, that have no source or measure in what we, in a visual association, term the real world and real weather, but whose expanse can alter how we perceive and think the world and our living with its matter as a matter of noise and fictions and bodies. These are the fictions produced by the artist, who hears the rhythm and textures that are the material and content of an invisible terrain, of weather that holds no certainty beyond its experience on the body, as a material among things. Its sonic textures and rhythms have no temperature and wind speed. They can't be measured and drawn on a flat surface to make maps or a score, and they cannot truly be named from a distance as references and sources, because they do not represent but generate a world in its contingency and from our entanglements. They do this in their capacity to perform the voluminous movement of a watery, weathery earth, where we are weatherized, liquefied, relieved of a firm sense of ground and space, and formlessly forming with, being as being in relationships. Listening to the work, we enter its undulations and feel our bodies perform the geography of waves, the volume of water and the fragile connections between all that moves in its dark expanse. We are sailors rather than listeners, listening sailors on a starless night. And so we navigate through this darkness where a place can emerge that is not bound to the shore as line and boundary, as recognizable symbol and sign of territory and land and normative geography. Instead, a dark geography unfolds that mobilizes space, generates environments and reveals their depth, where we cannot see ourselves looking, but hear ourselves listening and therefore sounding as part of the herd. The depth provides a sensory position from which to take responsibility of the world we hear, and thus what knowledge we produce in reciprocity and from the in-between. The noise machines creating bad weather brew a storm that troubles normative associations and exclusions, troubling the horizontal line of making sense and reading a score. Their sounds expand and contract an invisible territory made by their own performance, the materiality of things, human and more than human, and our practice of listening. Thus the noise machines generate an uneven and mobile terrain that is not there beforehand, measurable and at a distance, and rather than trying to find a ground beyond itself in which its sounds play out and works, The work's groundless ground is its coincidence and simultaneity with the contingent place and the contingent bodies that sounds create. In this sense, bad weather does not represent but revisions from the fictions of theatre noise machines, an impossible dimension that as narrative can be thought of as a literary fiction, a parallel fiction without effect on the reality of the world, but that as sound provides material and does real fictions, fictions whose alterity, lack of an analog source and reproduction, have a different potency and effect of how we imagine the work and how we imagine the world. This distinction is important not just aesthetically but also politically, since spatial imaginaries, as the social geographer Doran Massey reminds us, are powerful and have the capacity to influence the political consciousness and agency. And I quote, "The way we imagine space has effects. It has effects on our subjectivity, our sense of where we belong and what belonging might mean, on the way we understand our distances and proximities, the manner in which we experience frontiers and openness, and the way in which we perceive our reality as a spatial reality that is organized along representational, measurable, and geometric givens, or as a watery, dark, and unmappable geography of which we are part." For Massey, the vision of a global space, the cartography of its territory and movement, and I quote, "is not so much a description of how the world is as an image in which the world is being made." End of quote. The way we imagine, draw, map, measure the world is ideological, carrying historical investments and molding present beliefs into their future form. Thus, historical imaginary had effects on what the world came to be, what it is in a present actuality now, and it has effects on what the world came to be and what it is in a present, on what the world is being made, politically and socially, aesthetically and scientifically. In this context, noise machines that play bad weather conjure the invisible image of the world being made from water and wood, opening new and altered states for the way we think this materiality, our relationship and with its realities, desires and emergencies, and the dangers of hallucinations, because it is not raining. There are plenty of signs that climate change will be no exception. Rather than sparking solutions that have a real chance of preventing catastrophic warming and protecting us from inevitable disaster, the crisis will once again be seized upon to hand over yet more resources to the 1%. You can see the early stages of this process already. Communal forests around the world are being turned into privatized tree farms and preserves so their owners can collect something called carbon credits, a lucrative scam I will explore later. There is a booming trade in weather futures, allowing companies and banks to gamble on changes in the weather as if deadly disasters were a game on a Vegas crap table. From Naomi Klein's "This Changes Everything." Day 25. I post a selfie, take myself sweetly to the altar or the stage, bring myself flowers and rain. From Joanna Adcock, Split. According to literary theorist Mary Laura Ryan, for the duration of our immersion in a work of literary fiction, the realm of possibilities is recentered around the sphere which the narrator presents as the actual world. This recentering pushes the reader into a new system of actuality and possibility. As a traveler to this system, the reader of fiction discovers not only one new actual world, but a variety of APW, actual possible worlds, revolving around it. And I quote, "Just as we manipulate possible worlds through mental operations, so do the inhabitants of fictional universes. Their actual world is reflected in their knowledge and beliefs, corrected in their wishes, replaced by a new reality in their dreams and hallucinations." From Possible Worlds, Artificial Intelligence and Narrative Theory. However, these are not the knowledge hallucinations of extracted AI data mashups. Instead, it is an engaged and physical process that produces material and entangled hallucinations of the real from its possibility, which, following Klein, can, and I quote, access profound, previously unperceived truths. Sound amplifies this entangled possibility of reality and its generative hallucinations of unperceived truths, because it is different from literary fiction in that it does not propose something but does something. It is neither a representation of an actual event nor the construction of a parallel possible event. Instead, it is an event in all its possibilities with the capacity to reach plural understandings and new knowledges. The notion of the fictional world of the sonic work as an actual possible event within a universe of events allows us to think of the world as a plurality of possible and maybe even impossible worlds. This conjures unmapped and unmappable landscapes from which one actual world is accessible, but not as a hegemonic center and normatively real, in relation to which all other possibilities are measured and known. Instead, actuality is simply one possibility, simultaneously and equally real in its possibility rather than through its hegemony, decentering its norms and knowledge systems. The rain song score invites Rie Nakajima to let the rain drip on her head as she's listening while producing a sound of rain with her hands and its technological extensions, the small gadget, toys, things and instruments she performs with. This generates listening and sounding in an iterative cycle that performs as touching and being touched, describing the simultaneity of our existing with human and more than human bodies as a plural and generative being with. This iterative condition of being with, in a continuation cycle of sensory-motor actions, generates a participative and a world of possibilities, open, porous, vulnerable and wet, and also entangled and therefore able to respond and be responsible as well as responsible, in the Haravian sense of with all voices audible. The intersubjectivity and the connecting logic of these cyclical sensory-motor actions reveals reality as plural and interdependent, and our bodies as bodies with, reciprocal, relational, made from the same stuff as the world, and realized in a generative in-between rather than fixed as this or that, you or me. Thus, correspondingly, the ethics of these actions is participative, decided contingently by an involved position, always performative rather than set. It describes the how of being with, and is equally iterative and relational, performing a participatory ethics. Through Nakajima's performance of the rain song, the world becomes an assemblage of variables, sounded by invisible and inhibited, and thus unlimited relationalities, not tied to an actual center, but performing actual possibilities, from touch to ears to hands into sound, and so on. It makes the world possible as unthinkable as a limitless plurality of possible worlds, not framed by one actuality, but performed by the uninhibited possibilities between listening and sounding. The philosopher Nicholas Rescher fears the ontological cost of such an uninhibited possible world theory that has lost its absolute center and thus its referential and verifiable reality. By contrast, David K. Lewis, whose philosophy pursues a radical realism, is happy to bear those costs as he feels the benefits outweigh it in a logical space of possibility that represents a paradise for philosophers. That is a paradise to explore counterfactual, philosophical propositions and events and imagine all they could be and how they could relate, without a cold world to set a norm and hegemony, limiting the emancipatory power of plural and performative entanglement. Thus, in the actual possible worlds generated by the continuation cycle of listening and sound making, unimpeded by the ontology of an actual reality, I can conceive of a post-humanist world, where the human body stands not in an exceptional and authorial position, but as material in a continuum with human and more than human bodies, generated by a connecting logic of sound as contingent matter and the relational dimensionality, mattering with everything in real hallucinations, reaching plural understandings and unknown truths, and providing new knowledge, tools, and facilitating new scientific models and imaginaries. Nakajima's performance of the rain song permits us to follow this refiguration and to appreciate the relational and possible reality through the continuum on the body as a body's materiality, same as the world, heard under a shared skin of sound. One way to think this shared skin is via Margaret Chilcott, who asks us to abandon the idea of the body as a boundary tellus and suggests, and I quote, "There are only hybrid bodies, vulnerable bodies, becoming bodies, cyborg bodies, bodies, in other words, that always resist definition, both discursive and material." From Embodying the Monster, Encounters with the Vulnerable Self. In this sense, the body becomes a morphological imaginary of a post-human and post-humanist body. It defies the boundaries of logocentric reality and knowledge and emerges from the altering states of sonic hallucinations as a body with and a knowing with. That is reframed without a frame and without categories as an open, porous rhythm and materiality and practice, performing with every human, alien, hybrid and other body a corporeal continuity, because it is raining. No skin. Christopher was born without skin. He slid from his mother, all organs barely held in with muscle and sinew. Naked at 35, he's still covered in a wide net of scars from the unconventional patchwork grafting the doctors did. Like a skin quilt, they sewed onto him, like Edward Scissorhands, like Herman Munster. Christopher loves it. It makes him feel like a superhero who at any minute discovers his powers. He has seriously considered getting tattoos at all the scars and the sections, little points of black ink all over his body, emphasizing the thin white lines. Maybe cryptic symbols, something badass. Maybe he should shave his head. From Wolf Doctor by Angel Moss. Listening to Hippos Campos on Eino Dwyer's 2018 album Gallery, we hear an environment sounding as a beast that does not exist in flesh and bones, but that performs the possibility of the body in its corporeal continuity and hybrid ecology. The track was recorded between 2013 and 2015 in the shaft of the Brunel Tunnel in London. This shaft is a 50 feet wide and 50 feet deep reverberant space that hands water in the pump mechanism below, trains passing, as well as the planes overhead. The space is made audible through Dwyer's performance and its composition as an environment that has no form but performs the materialization of a diffuse milieu from everything it is made of, sounding a spatial fiction from its indivisible relationality. This piece is an invisible and indivisible conglomerate of everything that sounds in the performance of its environment, creating the sonic body of a horse sea monster, an underwater creature that, according to O'Dwyer, is constructed from the brain's location of memory, the hippocampus, from the idea of death, Hades, and from, and I quote, our separation from the wild and our animal nature, which we have forgotten. This sonic body remains invisible because it is not separate from, but is with the environment. It remembers our animal nature, and it cannot be judged and organized as it cuts across materiality, locations, and species, performing an interdependent and corporate environment of water, wind power, reverberation, and song, recalling forgotten connections and sounding the unreliable body of an insecure and plural identity that with a porous skin sutures together indivisible surfaces that visually remain apart but sonically create a diffuse and cyclical being with. In that sense, the body of the monsters and ours, replaces the context and referential infrastructure of theory and knowledge through the viscous and contingent milieu of sound. The work does not speak as category along horizontal chain of reference and on a historical line. Instead, it sings to drop into the vertical of sound, which remains unintelligible but felt and as part of matter as its unexplainable and sensorial real. What becomes audible is an environment that opens to a body with which it performs the idiosyncratic voices of multiple impossibilities, and that opens a space that has an ear to where matter is entangled and forming, rather than formed by the communication-enabling limitations of the semantic, of conventional knowledge and its historical foundations, determining categories which are paid for by the exclusion of the body in its contingent plurality, and by the misconstruction of the environment through an anthropocentric gaze. Instead, it generates the space of sonic fictions that ignore normative aesthetic and political values and move vertically into the depth of sound to produce a fuzzy environment that entangles human and more than human bodies and invites us into a dark motility to dance not on the surface but within unconventional dimensions that we inhabit in sounding and listening, and through which we can deviate from historical norms, emancipate and decolonize aesthetics' view, not by proposing another, but by seeing everything at once, traveling into a possible reality whose margins never end. Thinking of all that, I fell on a program concerning the planet Mars and projects envisioned for it by a European space agency. The pictures of Mars's surface brought me back to our oceans, but the film was made with a brown coloration that created the feeling that we are facing deserts. A special strangeness pertains to that planet. I have seen in Bloomington, Indiana, some 20 years ago, under a special microscope, a little piece of soil brought back from Mars, and I saw irisations foreign to anything I had seen on Earth. And the same is true for the rock formations and soil configurations that cover that planet. When we land there, we will be utterly disoriented. We are in dire need of that. Ethel Adnan in Shifting the Silence. This reorientation that Ethel Adnan suggests we are in dire need of cannot be found on another planet. We do not need to follow Elon Musk and Richard Branson and other billionaires on their quest to solve our current problems by going to another planet or bringing our detritus to another planet, which in any event is simply the continuation of the post-Enlightenment project of modernity, searching for objectivity through distance as measurable and categorizable, which ultimately enables colonialization. Instead, this reorientation and thus the solution to current emergencies can be found within the possible worlds of sonic fictions that generate the reality of this world from its plurality. It is in the performance of this world as a world of plural things and bodies, space and time, generated together in the continuity cycle of sensory-motor actions and in the entanglement of a porous hybridity that we can reach clients, and I quote, mind-altered states that can indeed assist in accessing profound and previously unperceived truths. It is through the wickedness of sound, its interwoven and interdependent complexity, that we can engage in the complexly interwoven and interdependent emergencies we are currently facing. Climate and public health, scarcity of resources, wars, social injustices, migratory pressures, and all are urgent issues which are not separate but generate a relational dimension, which the hallucinations of sound's voluminous dimensionality and its relational time-space milieu, its entangled environment where everything is with and in relation to everything else, can help us engage in. The suggestion is that it's from sound's impossible, indivisible volume and unconventional dimensions that we can generate the thinking and sensibility needed to work in between and across rather than within disciplinary lines, its boundary territories and hegemonic thought. To work instead with its entanglements and reciprocity from the depth of sound, where we cannot see ourselves looking, but can hear ourselves hearing, and thus can hear ourselves with human and more than human beings, and produce an imaginary of the world from its invisible relationality and in ethical participation. If we follow Massey's idea that the way we imagine the world has effects, and that these effects are aesthetic but also political, social, and epistemic, and that further, our image of the world is not just the present view, but the image in which the world is being made, then the bad weather, the rain, and the horsey monster have socio-political and knowledge effects on how we can imagine and live together in a world being made, correlationally, and how we can rethink our artistic and scientific engagement by undisciplining those disciplines that are looking for solutions to complexly interwoven, wicked problems on a straight line. It is for this reason that at the end of this performance talk, I want to advocate for a transversal sound studies, which I think has some synergy with the new ÄSR Lab inaugurated here. My aim for a transversal sound studies is a practical mode of theorizing with ears and voice and hands, and across disciplines and cultures, which inform radical, non-disciplinary and interloping potential of sound, which from a radical, non-disciplinary and interloping potential of sound develops the capacity to reveal and access the world in its complex relationality. The aim is to produce generative and plural knowledges not from outside the disciplines, but through embedded co-listening, creating hybrid undisciplinarities, listening in and with every subject to unperform its borders and the violence of singular hegemonic knowledge paths, hearing entanglements and complex contradictions, uncertainties and idiosyncrasies to contribute new solutions from sound's entangledness. Such a transversal sound studies does not define an autonomous discipline, but interlopes in every field to develop sonic competency as a connecting logic that thinks relationally, enables us to challenge hegemonic knowledge strands and handle the complex interwoven problems that describe the interdependencies of a viral world. In this sense, this transversal sound study is not an essentialized undertaking, but a move towards a multi-sensory studies that does not stop at invisibility, but senses it as a course to hear, see, smell, and taste, and so on differently, and create a physical image of the world in its entanglements.